The road into Barrow Creek was the kind you could drive with your eyes half closed, long, flat, lined with skeletal pines that bent in the wind like old men bowing to a ghost they could not name. It was 1963, and the town was little more than a scattering of clapboard houses, a diner with a flickering neon open sign, and a schoolhouse that still smelled faintly of chalk and coal smoke. On most nights, you could hear the river miles away, the steady hum of crickets, the occasional bark of a dog chained behind a gas station. But there was one night when all that sound died, as though the world had been wrapped in cotton. Old men on porches stopped mid-sentence, their pipes cooling between their fingers. Mothers paused with their hands on doorknobs, unsure why they felt the need to pull their children closer. The stars, usually so thick over Barrow Creek you could scoop them like grain, had thinned to a sickly handful, and in their absence, the sky felt hollow, a ceiling pulled too tight. No wind, no rustle of branches, no distant train whistle. Just a pressure low and steady, like the moment before a thunderclap that never came. People still whisper about that night, though their voices drop to a hush when the story reaches the part where the clock slowed. Some swear they saw the second hand hesitate, twitch and creep backward, as if time itself had lost its footing. The town carried on after that, because small towns always do, but the silence became a scar. 50 years later, the diner still serves coffee at midnight, but the regulars sit with their backs to the windows. They say it's just a habit, but ask anyone who was there, and their eyes will drift upward, to that same stretch of sky that once forgot to breathe. Tonight, a stranger arrives in Barrow Creek with a tape recorder and a worn leather journal, hoping to finally learn what was swallowed in that hush. The locals pretend not to notice, but behind their drawn curtains, the story stirs again, waiting to be told, and somewhere out beyond the tree line, a single light flickers, the first sign that the silence might not be finished after all. He sat hunched over the edge of his porch, a thin blanket around his shoulders despite the warm night, eyes fixed on the tree line as though the years had never passed. His name was Leonard Cross, once an airman stationed just outside Barrow Creek, now a forgotten man with a fading badge and hands that trembled when the wind shifted north. "It wasn't supposed to be my shift," he began, voice like dry leaves against pavement. Another man called in sick. "That's the only reason I was out there." The night of the incident, he said, the base was quiet. Too quiet for a place that usually hummed with the restless echoes of jet engines and midnight drills. The stars were clear at first, so bright they cast faint shadows on the tarmac, but within minutes they bent, warped, and seemed to vanish, swallowed as though the sky had folded in on itself. Radios went dead. Dogs in the kennels lay flat, whimpering without sound. Leonard described a light, not bright like a flare but heavy, pressing down from above until his ears popped. He remembered gripping his rifle tighter, the barrel pointed nowhere, because there was no shape to aim at, just a hum that vibrated in his teeth and a smell of burnt copper. "We wrote reports," he said, eyes narrowing. "Detailed. Measurements. Timings. Coordinates. They took them all." He paused then, a long pause where his fingers twitched as if reaching for a memory locked too deep. "We were debriefed in the morning. Not by our commanding officer, but by men I'd never seen in uniform before. Suits, dark ties, no names. They told us to forget what we saw, told us never to write it down." His voice cracked on the last word, and his gaze slid toward the darkening sky as though checking for something only he still remembered. Behind him, the porch light buzzed faintly, a weak glow against the encroaching night. "There's nothing left in the archives," he whispered, more to himself than to the recorder. "Not a single trace. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen." The tape clicked softly in the stranger's pocket, capturing the confession, while somewhere beyond the hills, that same low hum began to tremble through the pines again. The basement of the county archive smelled of rusted metal and damp paper, a place where history came to fade quietly. Amelia Kerr, a journalist known for chasing ghost stories that often proved more smoke than fire, sat cross-legged on the cold floor surrounded by folders stamped with dates older than her father's war medals. She had come for weather reports, routine flight logs, and regional papers from that winter in 1963, hoping for a footnote, a photograph, even a rumor. Instead, she found absence, pages torn clean from binders, columns blacked out not with ink but with careful, deliberate knife strokes, microfilm reels labeled yet empty. Flight paths ended mid-route with no signatures, as if the pilots had lifted off and never landed, or worse, as if someone had decided their landing didn't matter. Radar tapes were marked archived, but the shelves where they should have sat were bare, a thin line of dust outlining their removal. Even the small-town Gazette, famous for printing recipes beside obituaries, had a gap that week, 7 days where the press simply did not run. An impossibility for a paper that never missed a Thursday in 70 years. Each missing piece wasn't just a hole. Together, they formed a pattern, a silhouette of something deliberately erased. She lifted a charred scrap from a box labeled miscellaneous, its edges brittle as dried leaves. The only visible words were lights, unexplained, and military denies. Amelia felt a knot in her stomach tighten, the way it does when you sense you've stepped into a room that was locked for a reason. Why would anyone burn a weather report? Why erase a flight manifest from a domestic base? She scribbled notes in the margin of her leather-bound pad. Who ordered this? Why now? The deeper she dug, the more the silence became deafening, a curated void where facts should have lived. It wasn't just forgotten, it was forbidden, a memory scrubbed clean before it could ever turn to history. In the hush of that basement, the hum of the old fluorescent light above seemed louder, as though vibrating to a frequency she was not meant to hear. Somewhere, someone had made sure this night would vanish from the world's ledger. But the paper ash still smelled faintly of smoke, and the empty tape spools still turned slightly when she passed her hand over them, as if waiting to be played. The pines around Barrow Creek had a way of swallowing sound, the way snow swallows a road, quiet, heavy, almost deliberate. Amelia walked the narrow trail that curled behind the old sawmill, her recorder clicking as she listened to the voices of those who had lived through that winter. They were farmers, shopkeepers, widows with silver hair braided tight against the wind, each with a fragment of a memory they swore had never left them. "Cows gone without a trace," one man whispered, his thumb worrying the rim of his mug. "Not taken by wolves, no tracks, no blood. Just gone." A woman described waking to a green glow bleeding through her curtains, her fields lit as though the moon had fallen low, each stalk of frozen wheat casting a shadow in the wrong direction. Another, pale and shaking, swore that on that same night, her husband's watch stopped at exactly 2:17 a.m., the second hand twitching but refusing to move, while the mantel clock in the parlor stuttered to the same halt. Every clock in town did, an old mechanic added from his porch, voice brittle as kindling. Not for long, maybe a minute, maybe less. But long enough. As the testimonies layered, a pattern emerged, not just of fear, but of pause, like the whole valley had held its breath. Amelia noted the recurring time, underlining it twice. 2:17. "And then?" she asked, her pen trembling slightly against the page. "Then it was over," they said almost in unison. "Lights gone. The fields are cold. Animals never found." They led her to a clearing where the snow lay strangely flat, a circle where grass never seemed to grow in spring. Beneath a brittle mat of pine needles, a child's mittened hand uncovered a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, stiff with age. The group fell silent as Amelia peeled the fabric back just enough to see a sliver of metal, dull, pitted, and humming with a faint, steady vibration that made her fingertips itch. The forest seemed to inhale, the branches drawing close as though listening. "We've kept it here," the mechanic muttered, eyes darting to the tree-line. "Because the night we buried it, the noises stopped." The hum grew almost imperceptibly louder, a low, living pulse, and for a moment no one spoke. It was the same hour again, 2:17 on her watch. The night began like any other in that frozen stretch of January. Quiet roads slick with frost, a pale moon dragging thin shadows across the hangars of the Barrow Creek Air Base. Guards walked their rounds with coffee steaming in tin mugs, the steady murmur of the radio tower stitching their routines together. Then, at 1:58 a.m., the sky cracked open. Witnesses described it differently. Some said it was as if lightning had split the horizon without a sound. Others swore it was like a sunrise reversed, a sudden bloom of gold that turned every surface to ash and glass. Those stationed on the eastern runway reported the air turning heavy, their breath thickening, boots crunching as frost turned to dew in seconds. The light came not from above, they insisted, but from everywhere, as though the world itself had been struck hollow and filled with a blinding core. Communication lines hissed, then died. Radios screamed with static that tasted metallic in the mouth. One civilian, a farmer living 2 miles out, told of waking to find his fields bright as noon. His horses pressed flat against the barn doors, their eyes reflecting 2 suns where there should have been one. He walked outside barefoot, the snow warm beneath his soles, and looked up to see the clouds rolling in reverse, shadows curling against the wind like ink dragged across paper. At the base, mechanics dropped their tools as silhouettes rippled across the tarmac, long, thin, and shifting, as though the light itself had grown teeth. The floodlights failed one by one, leaving only that alien glow, white yet somehow bruised at the edges, pulsing like a heartbeat against the hangar walls. For 21 minutes, the town and its outposts stood in that false day, the stars erased, the night refusing to return. Clocks jittered, some spinning forward, others refusing to tick at all. The only movement came from the shadows, wrong-shaped things that seemed to move when you looked away, their edges fluttering like torn banners in a storm that never touched your skin. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light folded back into itself. No explosion, no thunderclap, just the abrupt return of night, colder than before, as though the heat had been borrowed and the dark returned with interest. When the first real dawn came hours later, the snow bore no footprints, no tire marks where trucks had patrolled, only a strange shimmering residue that clung to boots and tires for weeks, leaving rust in its wake. Those who were awake spoke little in the days that followed, but one phrase surfaced again and again in letters, journals, and unmarked tapes. A second sun that vanished without a dawn. Dawn had barely brushed the horizon when the rumble of engines rolled across Barrow Creek, low and deliberate, like thunder that refused to echo. Residents who hadn't slept after the night of the blinding light swore they saw them, 6, maybe 7 military trucks, their sides unmarked, their headlights blacked out save for a faint, narrow beam. They came from the east, tires grinding over snow that had not yet frozen hard, leaving thick tracks that veered toward the airbase and the silent pines beyond. No sirens. No public notice. Just the slow, inevitable passage of something meant to be unseen. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the trucks were gone. Farmers on their way to the early market followed the trail as far as they could, beyond the last turn, past the edge of the radar fence, until the rut simply ended, clean and abrupt, as if the weight of steel had lifted straight into the air. There were no turnaround marks, no splintered branches, no sign of retreat. Only a half-frozen patch of ground pressed flat in a perfect circle, its frost melted and refrozen like glass. Amelia traced the reports in old letters, interviews conducted in kitchen doorways and gas station lots, each story nearly identical. The convoy arrived without sound, left without trace, and never appeared on any manifest she could uncover. Even the base logs, meticulous for every fuel delivery and spare part, bore no reference to an unscheduled convoy that morning. Curious still were the names whispered by those who dared speak of it, especially one, Sergeant Paul Harker, a man seen barking orders beside the trucks, his breath fogging in the dawn, a clipboard tucked under his arm. Several witnesses remembered the scar along his jaw, the way his uniform fit like it had been tailored, his boots too clean for a winter road. But when Amelia scoured the service files, Harker didn't exist. No enlistment, no discharge, no next of kin. A photograph surfaced, blurry, torn at the edges, of a tall figure standing near the convoy's last known position, a dark coat over his fatigues, eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. Local rumor said the trucks carried something covered in heavy tarps, lashed down tight, edges rimed with frost. Some believed it was debris from the light, others whispered it was not from the sky at all, but left behind when the glow folded away. What unnerved Amelia most was not their sudden disappearance but the silence that followed. No missing persons reports filed, no request for fuel receipts, no chatter on radio bands. It was as though the road had been wiped clean not just of their tracks, but of their memory. Standing in that clearing decades later, she pressed her boot against the frozen circle where the tracks ended, the snow beneath it still harder than the rest. The wind shifted through the pines with a sound like a distant engine turning over, and for a fleeting second, she could swear she heard the echo of wheels that had never quite stopped rolling. The transcript arrived in Amelia's hands wrapped in a brown envelope with no return address, its pages brittle and watermarked with the faint outline of a government seal that no longer existed in any public record. It was labeled simply, Interview, January 1963, Subject 14. Most of the lines were thick with black bars, entire paragraphs swallowed in ink, but enough remained to stitch together a voice that felt both frantic and strangely restrained. The survivor's words trembled across the page. It came through where the air bent. We weren't ready. Seal the breach before. The sentence broke there, redacted mid-breath. Another line, scattered with static-like smears, read, We spoke to it, but the words were wrong. It answered something older. Amelia turned the pages slowly, the smell of mildew mixing with the sharp tang of old toner. There were mentions of coded warnings sent before the blackout, messages that never reached command, phrases repeated in a language no one on the base could identify. One technician described his own handwriting changing mid-report, as though his fingers were being guided, the letters looping into a script that didn't belong to him. Margins were filled with frantic scrawls. Containment failing, breach widening, do not, before the line was erased in thick black. Alongside the transcript were personal accounts, each more fractured than the last. One airman recalled waking with a nosebleed that lasted 3 days. Another swore whole hours had vanished between blinks. The nurse who attended them noted their heart rates never quite returned to normal, even when discharged. Their sleep was shallow, marked by sudden jerks as though falling through a trapdoor. They dreamed of corridors lined with mirrored glass, of a sound like distant water rushing through metal veins. A note in the margin, faded, barely legible, warned, If symptoms persist, relocate families. Exposure may carry. The most chilling passage came near the end, half covered but legible enough to spark a cold sweat. Do not attempt to recall it fully. Memory is the door. Survivors interviewed decades later echoed the same pain. Headaches that pulsed behind the eyes when the wind shifted east, moments of lost time when a clock's hands seemed to skip, nightmares that replayed the same instant, the light folding, the hum building, the air cracking apart. Amelia placed the final page down and stared at the tape recorder on her desk. It ticked once, though it wasn't recording. What struck her most was the signature at the bottom, missing. Only a smear of graphite where a name had been erased. Whoever had begged them to seal the breach had been written out of history with surgical precision, leaving behind nothing but this ghost of a warning. Outside, the wind rattled the window as if something leaned close to listen, and for a moment, Amelia thought she heard a faint phrase in a language she could not name, echoing from the envelope that now sat very, very still. The deeper Amelia delved, the less the pieces resembled a cover-up born of fear, and more a ledger of negotiation, entries hidden in ledgers that should not have existed, memos without signatures but with directives stamped in a shade of red reserved for things that never saw daylight. One classified memorandum, unearthed from a private collection in Denver, did not warn of mass hysteria or public collapse. It spoke instead of conditional exchange and containment protocols approved by external liaison. There was no name attached to that liaison, no insignia, only a single phrase repeated 3 times in the margins. Compliance ensures continuity. Amelia sat in the dim backroom of the county courthouse, the documents spread beneath a flickering bulb. The handwriting on one of the notes was hurried, as though the author was trying to finish before being seen. No dissemination. Payment delivered. Payment for what? She cross-referenced the dates, the names, the shipping manifests that appeared and vanished within the same quarter. The base had received no new equipment, no new personnel on record, yet entire shipments had been signed off and vanished from the chain of accountability. Locals, too, remembered something strange after the night of the blinding light and the vanished convoy. New fences erected overnight, a sudden influx of grain subsidies, a road paved to nowhere that ended at a gate without a name. The town prospered for a season, inexplicably flush with funding, yet every inquiry about the source returned the same phrase: classified infrastructure grant. One elder leaned close during Amelia's interview and whispered, "We didn't get paid to forget, child. We got paid to stay quiet, because they promised it would leave us be." The chilling implication unfolded slowly as she pieced together each scrap of correspondence. The event had not merely been hidden to prevent panic, it had been buried because someone somewhere had struck a deal. Silence in exchange for something unseen, something that required the removal of every trace. The very act of erasure was the bargain's proof. Amelia's pen hovered over her notebook, her breath frosting in the cold of that sealed room though the heater rattled at her side. If the agreement had been to protect the town from what appeared that night, then why did the documents phrase it as protection of asset? The word people never appeared once. Only assets. She closed the file slowly, the hum of the old fluorescent above deepening into a low, resonant throb that seemed to answer the question before she could even ask it aloud. Was the cover-up to protect the people, or to protect them? The thought lingered in her mind like a nail driven too shallow, catching every time she tried to look away. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the hills where the convoy vanished, a single light flickered once, then died, as if to remind her that some bargains are never truly kept, only paused. Even now, decades later, the land seems unwilling to forget. On cold mornings, a faint shimmer dances across the ridgelines, as though some invisible curtain is still shifting in the wind. Hikers speak of compasses spinning without cause, of radios picking up whispers where no station should exist. The official maps say nothing. The history books pretend nothing happened here. But the ground remembers. At the edge of town, an old farmhouse stands with its windows nailed shut. Locals pass it without looking too long. They'll tell you, if pressed, that its door locks itself every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same minute when, all those years ago, the clocks first stopped. No matter how many times it's replaced, the latch clicks on its own, as if the house itself is still holding something inside. Children have grown up, moved away, and tried to forget the stories their grandparents told them. Yet the air carries a hum some nights, low, steady, almost like breath. Farmers swear the soil beneath certain fields stays warm in winter and cool in summer, as though the earth has its own pulse. Calm has returned on the surface. The roads are quiet, the snow falls softly, and the sky is empty. But to those who linger a moment too long in the stillness, it feels as if the town is holding its breath, waiting for something to stir again. The town stands quiet now, its streets swept clean by time, its stories half buried beneath polite silence. New families move in, plant their gardens, repaint their fences. They do not ask why the cellar doors are braced from the outside, or why no one parks near the northern ridge after sunset. The past has been patched over, poorly, imperfectly, like wallpaper hiding cracks that still spread beneath. What remains are fragments, a newspaper clipping with its date scrubbed away, a stack of grainy photographs in which the sky seems wrong, a diary page that ends mid-sentence. Official records deny everything. Eyewitnesses grow old, and their children learn not to speak too loudly. But questions persist, quiet, stubborn things that creep back when the wind rattles the windows at night. One question refuses to fade. If history can be erased so easily, what else was rewritten? Was this town an accident or a rehearsal? Were the events buried because they were dangerous, or because they were true? You've walked its roads with us. You've seen the outlines of something too vast to name. Now we leave the story with you. What would you have done if this had been your town? Would you have stayed and waited? Would you have spoken, knowing they might erase you too? Share your theories. Share your doubts. Because sometimes the only trace left behind is the one someone else dares to remember.